Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the council chambers for our special council meeting this evening. It's Wednesday, October the 2nd, and I'm going to be calling our meeting to order at 5:30 p.m. We're going to start with a moment of silent reflection. Thank you. Moving on to item 1.2, our land acknowledgement. The municipality of Port Hope exists on the lands of the Mississauga Anishinaabe traditional territory covered by the Williams Treaties. We honor and recognize First Peoples as rights holders and stewards of the lands and waters on which we have the privilege to live, work, and play, including the Ganaraska Forest and River. We pay respect to elders past, present, and emerging. We commit to actions towards truth and reconciliation by recognizing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, strengthening ties with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, especially those who make their home in Port Hope, and learning from Indigenous ways of knowing and being. We do so by recognizing the past and working towards a shared future. Moving on to item number 2, are there any disclosures of pecuniary interest? I note that none were received prior to tonight's meeting. Seeing none, we'll move on to item number 3, deputations. It is now time for deputations from members of the public. Tonight, we have one deputation, and Mr. Fishlock has requested additional time and has also provided visual aids well in advance of the meeting. In accordance with the procedural bylaw, and as I always do, I have granted his request for extra time. So welcome, Mr. Fishlock, to the podium, and I think you know about that button on the right-hand side.
That's what I pressed. I didn't press it hard enough. Sorry. I guess I don't know about it, even though I've been here a few times. Thank you very much, Mayor Elena and councillors, for hosting this meeting tonight and the process that's connected with it. I'm speaking here tonight on behalf of Save Our Trees, which is as you probably know, a residents organization that's been active in the community for a number of years now. Our general mandate is to protect the natural heritage that we have here in Port Hope. We've been busy on issues such as the Penman Woodlot, but the PGI project generally and the issue that we understand will be addressed tonight, which is the proposed change in the cleanup criteria, is something we've been watching closely. We understand, and this has been indicated clearly in prior presentations by CNL to this council and generally through its public messaging, that without a change in the criteria, there will be a dramatic impact to our natural heritage in Port Hope, particularly our tree canopy. And that's why we've been active and wish to be here tonight to present our perspective on why this council, this municipality should support the proposed change, which, as we understand it, will take the form of an application to the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission at some point, hopefully in the near future. I want to thank all the friends and supporters who I believe are here tonight to come out and also indicate their interest and concern in this issue. So yeah, I worked hard to produce some slides. I'm not really technically gifted. I've had to self-educate myself. Hopefully I did an okay job, but the theme for my slides was digging less to save trees. You know, as I think you already appreciate, that if the criteria for arsenic is changed in the way that's proposed by CNL, which I believe is from 18 up to 50 parts per million. The number changed a bit over time, so we'll hear later, I guess, what the exact proposal is, that it will have a dramatic change on the size of the excavation works that will take place, particularly in the residential areas, which is what our primary concern is. They're slow. Our natural, that somehow went back. Does this go backwards? Okay, stay there. It doesn't want that slide. We talk a lot about saving trees, and I know I've been through various CNL presentations, and as many know, I used to work for the project here, and we often saw all sorts of statistical documentary information, but it never really told the story. Because unless you see it, you can't believe it. And as I think you know, at the end of this presentation, there's a short aerial video that we did, because as they say, often you can't see the forest for the trees. And, you go up the streets and that, but even this picture, which I took off, I think off the county website, which actually shows a lot of the trees that we have just west of where we are standing today. Sometimes you just don't really appreciate what we're really talking about in Port Hope. And we have an amazing mature tree canopy, particularly in the southern portions of Ward 1. And that's what is really at risk if we don't, what I call, right-size the project. Back in February 2023, and not long after this council was elected, Save Our Trees made a presentation that covered a number of issues, but it did spend a fair bit of time on the PHAI. I have a fair bit of history on the project from having worked there, but also spending time, I guess, studying on it. And it was never anticipated that some of the impacts that are predicted by CNL would happen back, certainly when the legal agreement was signed in 2000, 2001. And what was seen with the first residential work, particularly in the Alexander Street area across the tracks from Cameco, was much more disruptive, and took much longer than I think anyone with municipality and those involved with the project anticipated. And yet we were always told that there were no health risks associated with low-level waste, right, radioactive waste. Some of you probably know that there's a long story to how we got to the cleanup. A lot of years spent by the federal government and the CNSC telling people there wasn't much to worry about, but there were certain members of this community back in the 80s and 90s who couldn't be satisfied with that and continued to make the presence of low-level radioactive waste an issue. And so at some point, the decision was made between the federal government and this municipality to do something about it. And so we have the PHAI. A couple of years back, I was before this council, the earlier council rather, when the Lions Park remediation went public, and we spoke out about that and how there were other options available. That wasn't pursued at the time, but what it did do is woke up a lot of people living, particularly in the area, to really how destructive this cleanup project could be in the ravines in particular and any heavily wooded area. I think we have to remember that the PHA excavation plan in a conceptual form was developed in the 1990s. Back at that time, it wasn't anticipated to be a major residential component. It was really focused on a number of major sites. Many of those sites have been tackled already, where the impact on the community, let alone the vegetative and natural, it's only been applied in a few limited cases so far. Thankfully, this municipality made the decision to apply it to the Alexander Ravine, or agree or accept CNL's decision to apply it to the Alexander Ravine. But there's a role for it going forward, particularly if this change by the CNSC doesn't actually happen. And it's still a long way off. The other thing that became evident on the 24th when CNL did its update was the extent of the work they want to move forward with, irrespective of a criteria change. I don't know personally how many of the property owners that are in those colored areas on those maps for the next 3 years have actually made decisions to have excavation work done as opposed to other ways to deal with their property. But the protocol for special circumstances could be used to save more trees, and I think in an acceptable way. This municipality historically has opposed the use of special circumstances by the project. I'm hoping that attitude has changed to the extent that members of this council have been engaged in the approach of your staff to dealing with the project. But there will be a big role for special circumstances going forward, irrespective of this arsenic criteria change. Do I have to point this in a particular direction? There seems to be some technique. So I'll leave the rest of the technical aspects of the arsenic criteria change to CNL. I want to say a few things about, why trees are important. From a climate change point of view, they could be very critical. 1 ton of atmospheric CO2 can be offset by between 31 and 46 mature trees. That's just an example of one expert's calculation. We can see that a lot of our forests in Western Canada are burning frequently. Not only are they not holding carbon dioxide anymore and contributing to climate change, but that's why we have to protect the trees we have in other parts of the country. Trees also enhance our mental health. In terms of anxiety and depression, it's been found that those who walk for 15 minutes in a forest experience less symptoms compared to those walking in an urban setting. I'm a big hiker. I spent a lot of time in the Ganaraska Forest and the Northumberland Forest and walking on the road allowances throughout the municipality. And I can attest to the benefits. I couldn't live without it. I think a lot of us who live in the tree-lined streets of this community, really do benefit from the presence of that tree canopy. I just threw out a few pictures of what is happening. I mentioned the Alexander Ravine. There's a good news story there that a lot of what you see on the edges here, and it goes well around beyond the picture itself, will be saved, but there's still a lot of trees coming down. We have sites like this in other parts of our community, such as the South Highland Ravine between Bedford and Highland Drive, where there's similar extensive disruptive work like this happening. I can't speak to what opportunities may have been had to prevent some of that. I do understand CNL is trying to minimize the impact, but there's, in my opinion, areas in there that didn't necessarily have to be cleaned up because it's a ravine and wasn't a child's playground. But this is what we want to avoid, is scenes like this in our community. This is a picture from when the Lions Park trees came down. Again, this is what we want to avoid. It's what's left behind that's beautiful, and we have so much of it in this community. This is what we want Port Hope to continue to look like, the streets we have that are tree lined. And that's what we hope that this criteria change will help us preserve. And we're Save Our Trees is hoping this council will also support other steps that will need to be taken to minimize the impact of this project on our tree canopy. So with that, I have, I think, a depiction of how extensive the tree canopy is in Port Hope. And I hope you like the music. I have to tell you, I was talked out of a different score. It was going to be Chariots of Fudge. I still think that was the better one. The center of the drone went up right in the middle of the ravine that exists between Dorset and Augusta Street. So it's sort of swirling on a point at the eastern end. It's a pretty big canopy, eh? And that's not all of it, really. Anyway, thank you very much. Save Our Trees looks forward to working with the municipality, this council, to, as I say, right-size the cleanup project. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Oh, and I'm going to stay consistent with no clapping in the council chambers as a rule of order. Thank you very much, Mr. Fishlock, for that presentation. And if you don't mind, maybe standing still at the microphone, because I'm sure there might be some questions and comments from around the horseshoe. So I'm going to just start with my left and Council Darrell.
I just want to say thanks for the presentation. I'm still learning a lot about this stuff, and it was a great presentation, and I look forward to hearing more from you. Thanks.
So Adam.
Thank you. So thank you so much, not only for you to come, but for everybody here to come and show the support. This is what we look for every day, is to actually get the community to engage and let us know how you feel so we can move forward. I couldn't agree more with you on a lot of the different things, especially what trees do for your mental health. I am also a big hiker. I spend a lot of time in the Ganaraska Forest. I love having the trees around. Actually, if you look at my photo album, most of it is of trees. It's just the way it is. So I can't thank you anymore for coming and doing this. I really appreciate having you and everyone here coming to show your support for this. So thank you.
Councillor Mink.
So thank you as well, and to ditto Adam here, thank you for everybody that came. I think one thing that's very noticeable for me now, compared to, you did mention historically previous terms of council, is that the importance and the urgency is still very relevant, but the tone that I'm hearing is much calmer. So I hope with that, the delivery of your presentation was fantastic too. So I'm hoping with just how the feelings of people that we can move forward in the right direction. I think this is the right step. So thank you.
Councillor Lass.
Oh, Robert, how are you? Haven't seen you in a while. You know, we have to make tough decisions every now and then regarding the cleanup, and one of them was you addressed it, Lions Park. We were faced with either we leave it as is and leave the trees that were there and not allow anybody to ever use that property again for health reasons, or do the remediation, which looked ugly when it was being done. Looks a hell of a lot better now that the trees have started to take shape. And, you know, there's 2 times to plant a tree, 100 years ago and today. So, you know,
Just the microphone. Thank you.
There were legitimate points of view, and there were obviously disagreements. We felt very passionately about it. I think, as you've probably heard since then through the grapevine, there was as much concern about the process and some of the things, the way things proceeded through that upset people. But I may be back here to talk about Lions Park. We won't get into it tonight, but information has come up through the risk assessment process that indicates that the site has not been cleaned up. So, and that I understood that at the time that the expectation it would be cleaned up, or we'd go into risk management measures. You're going to get both. So we've lost the trees, we'll have a contaminated site, and it'll have to be risk managed. I hope that's been communicated by CNL to you by now. So we can talk about that later in terms of whether in retrospect we didn't get what we expected.
okay, and then, so I'm going to give you a reverse example of what we've done. Lenton Lane, it was pretty barren, and we had some money. Anybody remember Lou Rinaldi?
Yes.
Okay, and he had granted us some money, and before he left office, and it was about 50,000, and we decided at the time to use part of that money to plant Lenton Lane.
Mm-hmm.
And we really didn't go out to the public. We didn't really go to council. We just had them planted. And it was between the director of marketing, or the marketing manager at the time, and myself. And we got a little pushback from the people that said, well, they weren't the right type of trees and we should study it further. We said, no, we're just planting them. These things will live and they canopied, they look beautiful. So again, tough decisions, but you just move on.
Yeah.
Thank you though for your presentation.
Thanks.
Councillor Todd.
Hey, Robert, thanks so much. It was a great presentation. I liked your choice of song. One of the things that I really appreciated about the presentation was how you drew attention to our ability to apply special circumstances. I think that's an important thing to draw attention to, especially as we're looking to move forward, as you say, irrespective of what comes forward in the other reports. So thanks for that.
And Deputy Mayor.
What's that?
That it wasn't good enough, right?
No, it was beautiful. Thank you as always, and thanks for keeping up the work with Save Our Trees. I know it's been a long road for those that have been involved over the years, but I think you're seeing, here we are having this conversation at the council table, and that's a lot. That's a big deal. So thanks for continuing to be part of that conversation. And I will just say I appreciate the reference to the special circumstances. I think it's always good to have a good plan B, but when there's a straightforward approach that will achieve sort of great ends without all of the additional labor and reports and studies and whatever that go along with a special circumstance. I think it's important for us to stay focused on plan A for the time being, if that's okay.
And thank you for being here. Thank you for the years of bearing witness to this project and for being consistent in your insistence of accountability and action. I think it's really an invaluable asset for this community. We've had lots of discussions about arsenic. We've had some discussions about special circumstances. And I think that one of the things that was so valuable about your presentation is that you gave us that time frame. And historically, when the project started, it was a very different time in terms of science, in terms of evidence, in terms of knowledge, in terms of the climate crisis that we find ourselves in. And so we find ourselves in a day and a time where maintaining the tree canopy becomes even that much more important and pressing. And we do have a number of policy levers that are open to us, whether it's talking about arsenic changes, whether it's talking about special circumstances, and even more lofty conversations about the rights of nature and legal personhood, which we've started to do around with Alderville Nation around the Ganaraska River and Rice Lake. So I think it's very much front and center. And of course, the municipality is actively developing a climate action plan as well. So I think it's very much on the front of all of our minds. And I think we are very committed to some of the ideals that you're putting forward in your presentation today. So thank you very much once again for coming to council.
Thank you again, and we appreciate it, and we appreciate the sentiments you've expressed. And we've known since you've all been elected that things are different. But sometimes it's hard to, I guess, change your sort of approach when you've still got a lot of baggage. And many of us, like myself, had a lot of baggage from the prior administration and earlier, and a little bit of frustration. So we appreciate everything you're doing. Let's keep it up. Thanks.
Thank you. Moving on then to our next agenda item, but before we do so, the motion in front of us is to receive this for information. So can I get a mover and seconder? Moved by Councillor Darrell, seconded by Councillor Mink. All in favor? And that is passed unanimously. Moving on to item number 4, items for consideration. 4.1, presentation by Jennifer Turner, Manager, HWP, Environment Management, and Ron Brecher, Toxicologist, Independent Expert regarding proposed change to the Port Hope Area Initiative, cleanup criterion for arsenic. Welcome back to Chamber.
Thank you. Robert is quite tall, so I'm going to have to lower this a little bit. We don't have any music in our presentation. I apologize.
I left my guitar at home.
You did. You thought about bringing it. What we're going to do tonight is we're going to provide you with some additional information regarding the change to the cleanup criteria for arsenic. Specifically, we're going to give you the information you need to ensure that you are making an informed decision in regards to the path forward. My name is Jennifer Turner. I am the manager of the Historic Waste Program Environmental Management Department. I've been with CNL since 2018 and initiated the change to the cleanup criterion for arsenic. And thank you. And have been working on this for just over 5 years now. So it's definitely a labor of love at this point. It has taken longer than we initially thought it would. And we're going to go through some of those reasons in the presentation. With me tonight is Dr. Ron Breacher, and I'll let Ron introduce himself.
I have a doctorate in toxicology, which is basically the science of poisons. And my whole career of a little more than 35 years has been spent assessing risks related to chemicals in things that people are exposed to. So that could be things in the environment like soil, or water, and air, but also consumer products, food ingredients, and that type of thing. For this project, I've been retained by CNL as an independent expert to advise them on the work that the consulting team is doing on the risk assessment. So to independently review that risk assessment, advise whether I'm in agreement or if I disagree, push back and get resolution to any of the issues that I raise. And also to be available to CNL to provide presentations like this tonight.
So at CNL, we do start with a land acknowledgement. I know, Mayor Elena, you had a beautiful acknowledgement tonight. The work that we do is on the lands and waters traditionally belonging to the Williams Treaties First Nation communities, especially under the Gunshot Treaty. We are privileged to do work and to live on these lands and to involve the nations in decision making as part of the restoration of the lands after we've removed contaminated or contaminants from the land.
Maybe a dead battery.
Nope, there we go. Okay. So a little bit of history about the cleanup criteria. The cleanup criteria, the development of it was established as a preference by the community of Port Hope. There is a strong desire for the metals that form the cleanup criterion or criteria to be based on provincial generic criteria. So they looked to the province of Ontario for already published generic criteria, and they matched our cleanup criteria for each one of those metals to the provincial standard. This is a provincial standard, so it doesn't mean it's necessarily health-based. It is just the provincial standard using the statistical formula the province uses to set soil standards for different kinds of land use within the province. Once the cleanup criteria was established in the environmental assessment, we moved to the waste nuclear substance license process, and the cleanup criteria for the project were put into the waste nuclear substance license, both nuclear and metal contaminants, which means that any change to any one of those contaminants or any one of those metals in a less safe way, which means to a higher value, does require that we go to a full CNSC hearing. So that is the process that we're involved in right now, which is the risk assessment to determine the safety case for changing the cleanup criteria for arsenic. You'll see on the screen the 4 primary contaminants of potential concern. That's what we use in our project to figure out where waste is on people's properties. For the purposes of this presentation, we're only discussing arsenic. Robert Fishlock did a great job of explaining what drove us to this point in the project. Robert and I worked together from 2018 until he left the program. And what struck me as a new employee at CNL when we were just breaking ground was it took longer than we expected it would. We were disturbing more soil than we thought we would be. And when we looked at the reasons why that was happening, we found that in almost all instances, it was related to arsenic. Arsenic, of all of the metals in soil, is the most mobile. And so even when we had finished cleaning up the other metals, we were still going after arsenic because it had moved slightly over the decades. And that caused us to have to go wider and go property line to property line in some instances. This created a lot more impact than we were anticipating. Robert is 100% correct. When we initially planned for this project, we thought there were only going to be a few hundred private properties that needed to be cleaned up. Right now, we've almost quadrupled that number. So the impacts are going to be more widespread throughout the community, and the extent of remediation is much more impactful than anyone thought it would be 20 years ago. But importantly, we're still not seeing any adverse impact to human health or the environment from the presence of low-level radioactive waste in the community. So what kind of engagement have we done between 2018 to now to get where we are? Lots of engagement with Williams Treaty's First Nation communities on the health implications of the proposed change to the arsenic criterion, ecosystem impacts, and they have requested broader studies, which we have accommodated through the risk assessment and ancillary studies, other studies to go with that, like the community report that we prepared. Lots of discussion with property owners. Property owners have been coming to us with their grievances, and we've listened, and we're making changes to the program. This is a central change to the program that will address many of the grievances that have been brought to us about the disruption that property owners are facing. The impact that this is having on the community cannot be minimized. There have been trees come down. There have been vegetated areas that have been removed. There have been ecosystem impacts. And what we're doing is we're trying to make a change, the criterion, to mitigate future impacts because we're seeing very real impacts right now within the community. Where did the arsenic come from? Primarily, it came from the processing of ore by El Dorado between 1930 and 1955. El Dorado had a stack associated with it, and the gases from the stack went over the downtown area, that area closest to the harbor waterfront area. And as the particulate fell out of the sky, arsenic fell with it as a component of the particulate and rested on the ground. That's what we call stack deposition. It's superficial deposition of arsenic and some of the other contaminants right at the surface of the soil. Second, we have fill material. So the byproduct of the processing of the ore created a fill material that looked like soil, great for leveling your property, great for putting under roadways, road beds, filling in ravines, building up areas of the community for development. Unknowingly, it was contaminated with some of the metals that we're seeing now. Industrial waste. There are other industrial processes within the community that have contributed arsenic within the community. Coal gasification plant, as an example. Pesticides and herbicides. This is an agricultural community, and Port Hope has grown substantially into areas that used to be agricultural areas. So we have arsenic in soil as a result of past agricultural practices. And of course, arsenic's also naturally occurring in the environment. So what did we do? We started with numbers, right? We started with statistics. We looked at 25,000 approximately soil samples where we had done a full suite of parameter investigation for all the metals. And when we looked at that, we said, how many times are we expanding our remedial area just because arsenic has gone outside of where we're also finding radiological material? And of the 4 primary contaminants of potential concern that we make decisions based on, 10% of the time, so 4 times as much as any of the other contaminants or metals, we're making decisions based on arsenic and the movement of arsenic in soil. So the picture is really interesting. We're trying graphically, because not everyone learns the same way, to demonstrate what we mean by this. So within the yellow box on the screen, we have what we would consider a defined area of low-level radioactive waste. We have the 4 primary metals that we look for as we define low-level radioactive waste, and we have arsenic in there. Those are the yellow dots. Just outside of that, between the yellow and the white lines, we have arsenic that has been mobilized, and it has moved outside of where we find low-level radioactive waste. We would still consider this associated with low-level radioactive waste, but it's commingled in areas where we would have naturally occurring arsenic. And then, of course, outside of that area, we just have naturally occurring arsenic. In Port Hope, very specifically, when we look at those 25,000 soil samples, we found a natural variation in arsenic in the community, as you would expect to see anywhere else in Ontario. We have background levels of arsenic from 3 micrograms per gram, or parts per million. They're equivalent, they're the same in soil, all the way up to 23 parts per million in soil, naturally occurring, even though our cleanup criteria is 18, which is set by the province. That means that in some cases, we are cleaning up arsenic that's naturally there, but we don't know because we can't distinguish between the two in the absence of radiological material. Maybe I'm just not pressing hard enough. Point here. Oh, you have the magic. Okay.
So this slide, let's talk about the picture first. It illustrates graphically how a risk assessment is done. So in order for a risk to be present, you have to have 3 components. First, there has to be a hazard that we're concerned about. And in this case, the hazardous material is arsenic, specifically arsenic in soil. Second of all, there needs to be a person, a tree, a fish, a bug, a bunny, something that we care about, that we want to protect. We call those receptors. So those would either be residents, perhaps construction workers, perhaps part of the natural environment. And the third thing that you have to have in order for a risk to be present is you have to have a way for the hazard to get to the receptor. In other words, exposure has to occur. If you have a hazard and a receptor, but no way for the receptor to be exposed, there can't be any risk. So that's at the heart of the risk assessment. And such an assessment was commissioned by CNL to be done for Port Hope. This process, we've used the term highly conservative, but I want you to notice it's a small c conservative. It's not an expression of any kind of political approach to this. When the word conservative is used in this context, what it means is likely to overstate the risk. So everything that's done in the risk assessment by design is much more likely to overestimate the risk than to underestimate the risk. And I think we would all intuitively agree, like if we were making decisions for our family, we'd say that erring on the side of caution is a good thing. And it is. It is. When you're doing a risk assessment, you don't want to underestimate the risk. That being said, overestimating the risk doesn't come without any consequences. If you overestimate the risk, you may do much more than you need to solve a problem. And that's the kind of situation that we're in here. So although these risk assessments are designed to be protective of human health and the environment, this approach towards overestimating risk so that you don't make a mistake in the wrong direction, putting people at risk, can lead you to think that the risk is higher than it really is. Now with arsenic, that previous slide, I talked mostly about the exposure connecting the receptor to the chemical. Turns out for arsenic, it's a little bit more complicated because there's a couple of different forms of arsenic. One is called organic arsenic. That's arsenic that's associated with carbon. And that's really not commonly found in the environment at all. Where it's found is in shellfish. So most people get most of their organic arsenic exposure from shellfish. Inorganic arsenic is what you find in soil, air, drinking water, food other than shellfish. And it is the one that toxicologists, people like me, have the most concern about from a health perspective. The organic form seems relatively benign. It's the inorganic form that we need to be more concerned about because it can be introduced into the environment in all the ways that Jen already spoke about. It enters the food supply, and that's how people can then be exposed. So some of the foods that you might find in organic arsenic are fruit juices, rice, but you also find it in soil from past industrial practices and naturally occurring. In the port, I think you want to talk about this, right?
Because it's Port Hope specific.
Mhm.
So in Port Hope specifically, we've already talked about arsenic and where we might find it in very specific different types of environments. Of course, associated with low-level radioactive waste, historical industrial practices, agricultural chemicals, and even pressure-treated woods. Okay, arsenic is a preservative in pressure-treated wood. So if you have decking with pressure-treated wood, you have arsenic in your decking. Inorganic arsenic resulting from El Dorado Nuclear Limited is the one that we are focusing on here in terms of your arsenic exposure. Interestingly, arsenic does not accumulate in the environment like some other chemicals do, and it does not move up the food chain from one organism to the other. And that's specifically because the type of arsenic that we're dealing with is the inorganic arsenic. And Ron will discuss that later. It's not readily absorbed by the tissues of the body. And when we talk about bioaccumulation, which is a really big word, it really means how likely are the tissues of your body going to absorb and hold on to a metal. And so what we find is for arsenic, your body doesn't like to hold on to it. You might take it in, but then your body says, oh, this isn't where it's supposed to be, and your body will excrete it. So we see no measurable uptake of arsenic in Port Hope trees. We did study the trees. We looked at trees, especially in the Alexander Street Ravine, growing in soil with contaminants. We didn't find the contaminants up in the tree, in the leaves, in the nuts, which is why people can use the trees on their properties when we remove them. We take the stumps over to the long-term waste management facility for management appropriately because they were potentially in soil that had the metals in it, but the tree itself is clean. So the tree can be sent to the Port Hope High School for woodworking class. It can be turned into picnic benches. It can be turned into beautiful sculpture, whatever you'd like to do with those trees. And during the EA baseline report, we did look at fish in the harbor to see if fish and the aquatic organisms of the harbor, we call them benthic organisms, or the ones at the bottom that would be most exposed to contaminated sediments. Were they impacted? Was the health of the aquatic system impacted? And we did not find any measurable levels in the fish or in the benthic organisms. So that tells us that the metals that were here in the community as a result of the former El Dorado facility is not having an impact on the local environment. So what is parts per million? These can be difficult concepts when we talk about very small numbers. Parts per million is the same thing as a microgram per gram. So what is it? It's 1 grain of sugar in 273 sugar cubes. So you can imagine a pyramid of sugar, and it's 1 grain of sugar. It's 1 minute in 2 years. So sometimes when I get really stressed out about something, I say to myself, is this going to matter in 5 years? And if it's not going to matter in 5 years, I'm not going to worry about it. maybe to the extent that I might have otherwise. If you're a football fan, like my husband, it's one credit card on a football field. Right? So we're putting now risks into context so that they're more easily understood. We just finished corn season, one kernel in 1,250 ears of corn. I do tend to eat quite a lot of corn. I can't eat that much corn. So it just gives you a sense of, it's a very small number out of a very large number.
Okay. One of the things that's important in a risk assessment is to figure out where people's exposure comes from. And in the risk assessment that was done by CNL's consultants, they looked not only at Port Hope residents, but they had to have something to compare it against. And that was a typical Canadian who's drinking municipal water. And this pie chart shows pretty dramatically, I think, that more than 90% of most people's exposure comes from grocery store food, 77%. That's wherever you live in Canada. 14% comes from the municipal drinking water. Those two together add up to 91%. The leftover amounts come from soil, dust, and homegrown garden produce. So that's for a typical Canadian. That's why it's not really surprising that when the soil concentration of arsenic changes a little bit, or even a lot, you don't see much change in a person's exposure to arsenic. It's because very little actually comes from soil, only 6% for the average Canadian. If the arsenic levels are a little higher, that percentage will be a little bit higher. But still, even in Port Hope, the vast majority of exposure comes from grocery store foods and drinking water. There we go. So I said before that risk assessments are designed to overestimate risk. So they don't always use realistic assumptions. Often they use assumptions that give an inflated estimate of exposure or an inflated estimate of toxicity of the substance. So this is looking at some of the exposure assumptions that were assumed when the consulting team was evaluating 18 parts per million versus 50 parts per million for a cleanup standard. So first of all the exposure pathways were considered. It wasn't just looking at soil by itself. They looked at store-bought food, homegrown produce, drinking water, inhalation of dust or soil, and touching or ingestion of soil as well. They didn't assume that exposure happened sometimes. They assumed it happened 24 hours a day, every day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. So you can imagine for the Port Hope resident, that means no visits to Toronto, no holidays to Florida or wherever you go for your holiday. People were assumed to be here 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 a year. They were always exposed to the maximum concentration. Now, the average concentration in Port Hope is below 18, right? But we assumed in the risk assessment that everybody in Port Hope was exposed all the time to 50 parts per million wherever they went, whatever they did. And furthermore, we assumed that the exposure began at birth and went on for the full 80-year lifetime that was assumed. So you can see that if I put all of those overestimates together, I'm going to end up with an overestimate of risk in my answer. And that's a good thing, as I said. We don't want to underestimate risk. But you also have to look at this thing with an objective eye and realize how realistic your estimate is. Because it's going to have consequences for the risk calculation. So this is the calculation that I find the most compelling here. If there's 17,000 people in Port Hope, and we make all of those assumptions about exposure that estimate on the high side, if there's 18 parts per million in the soil, we get around 3 people 3 excess cancers related to this arsenic over the next 80 years. That 3 is against a background of about 30%, so 6,000 over the next 80 years. If instead we use a 50 part per million number, about 3 people, 3 excess cancers still occur in 80 years. In other words, the difference in risk is less than 1 person. Now, people don't come in fractional values. You can't have half a person or a quarter of a person. So what less than 1 really means is 0. Statistically, I have to say less than 1. But there's no such thing as a fractional person. So really that means 0. The scale here from green to red is it's called the Paling scale, and it's used to help cancer patients understand their risks. I find this scale really useful because it stops us from having a conversation about how much risk is acceptable. I'm not going to talk about what the acceptable level of risk is. I just want to compare what levels of risk do an average Canadian face versus a person living in Port Hope that's otherwise the same. And this scale goes from minimal risk, extremely rare events, to very high risk, things that are very likely, 1 in 10. And if you look at the 4 communities we looked at, so we looked at a typical Canadian community on a private well water and a typical Canadian community on municipal water, you can see both of those are in the low risk range. The risk ranges from about 1.4 to about 2 excess cancers per 10,000 people. Now let's look at the Port Hope situation at 18 or 50, and you can see that the result is between the 2 Canadian typical values. It's right within the same range and also still within the low risk range. So again, this is showing 2 things. Number 1, in terms of cancer risk and arsenic, Port Hope residents face about the same risk as typical Canadians, regardless of whether they're on well water or municipal water. And not only that, Port Hope residents face about the same risk as typical Canadians, regardless of whether the soil cleanup number is 18 or 50 parts per million. One of the things that can be done to help ground-proof a risk assessment is to do a biological study. So arsenic, after it's taken up into the body, your body excretes it in the urine. So measuring the urine concentration of arsenic is a good way of monitoring recent exposure. It's not good for long history of exposure, but very good for recent exposure. And the urinary level would rise and fall with the absorbed dose of arsenic. But you need quite a big change in order to see anything, and you don't get that change. If we look at other studies where arsenic has been monitored in soil for urinalysis, you really see that the changes are going to be too small to see. Second of all, the predicted changes that would happen between 18 and 50 still fall within the typical Canadian population. So make it hard to see any difference. Third of all, we don't have many Port Hope residents that live in the areas that were most impacted. And so we don't have highly exposed people to include in the population. And furthermore, I've already said most properties contain an average of less than 18 micrograms per gram. And most of the surface soil that was impacted, particularly the surface soil that was affected by stack depositions falling out of the air, that's already been cleaned up. So I'm all for doing studies, but they have to, number one, address an important question. This is certainly an important question. But two, be capable of giving you a useful result. And urinary biomonitoring was concluded simply not to be useful for this community. So the alternative approach was taken to look at what's been done in other communities. And the consulting team looked at studies in 4 different countries: Canada, the US, Australia, and Britain, Great Britain. Looked at multiple lines of evidence. So what did the risk assessment predict? What were the health records of those communities showing? And also, what was the urinary arsenic results showing? And what they found is that below about 100 micrograms per gram, or below 100 parts per million, there really isn't much of a relationship between arsenic in soil and what you see in urine. Again, not surprising, because so little of our total exposure comes from soil. Furthermore, no dose-response relationship between measured dose and any health outcomes. And furthermore, all of those studies, or most of those studies, I should say, concluded that no cleanup was warranted, even though the levels were higher than the generic standards or objectives in those jurisdictions. So based on that, we think that if an arsenic biomonitoring study could have been done usefully in Port Hope, we don't think it would have shown any relationship, or at least a strong relationship, between soil arsenic and urine. Again, suggesting that soil is not a big contributor to exposure. I'm not sure what happened there. Let's try again. There we go.
So when we looked at the comparison communities, I'd like you to focus on the top 4 lines or rows of this table. These are all communities in Ontario where over the past 20 odd years, the Ministry of the Environment, Conservation and Parks has made decisions to allow alternate remediation criteria for those communities. And if you look at the second column, you'll note that very often there's more than one cleanup criterion that's been identified by the ministry. And they've done that again as a method of conservatism based on land use. So for properties where you'd have more exposure of sensitive populations like children, the cleanup criterion that they chose for arsenic was a little bit lower. You can see in Balmerton it was 58, garden soil 50, in Deloro, Wawa, there's a range there, Falconbridge, there's a bit of a range, so they only state 78. But most importantly, what we see is that they have approved alternate criterion at 50 and above for many communities in Ontario, and have not required soil remediation in those communities based on the same type of risk assessment that we've done for Port Hope. Most importantly is Deloro. 1999, Deloro processed the same ore that was processed in Port Hope, and the ministry approved a range of values between 50 and 216, depending on the zone, as being safe for the community, with an average range of 111 for the entire town, the town of Deloro. So we do have precedents that have been set in Ontario. We have precedents that have been set elsewhere in Canada and globally that demonstrate that at levels below 100, as Ron mentioned, there's very little correlation between a person's health or exposure to that metal and relative risk.
Before you move on, there's one other point I want to make about this slide, and that is the number that's being proposed for Port Hope by the consultants at 50 is not some crazy number that's outside the range of reality. These risk assessments, to get them through a regulatory process, they can take years and multiple iterations of comments back and forth, comments and revisions. And yet they've landed on numbers in general between, 16 and 239. 50's right in that zone. It's not like the consultants have proposed a number of 1,000 or something like that. It's right in the zone that other risk assessments have landed on and that the regulators have landed on.
So is the proposed new level safe? And safe is a difficult word to use in a presentation like this because safe means different things to different people. Safe is very often, like it has a definition in the dictionary. You can define what safe is, but more often than not, safe is how somebody feels about something. So if you were to ask me, do I think the proposed new level is safe? I would say insofar as we're comparing the levels of risk between 18 and 50, between a typical Canadian on municipal water and a typical Canadian on well water, that it is safe because it's in the same level of low risk. That would be my definition specific to this presentation. What supports that definition of safe? We have the CNSC synthesis report published in 2019 that looked at more than 40 independently done health and epidemiological studies, as well as environmental studies, each demonstrating that there was no impact from the nuclear industry's operations on human health and the environment in Port Hope. That's a synthesis report done by our primary regulator. The report confirmed no adverse health effects. No contaminants in the Port Hope soil were impacting the residents of Port Hope. They commissioned studies that we've done for this project specifically to change the cleanup criterion for arsenic have also concluded that changing the criterion from 18 to 50 results in low risk to residents of Port Hope, or frankly, no change in risk because the risk was low at 18 and the risk is also low at 50 parts per million. This is protective of human health and the environment, but more importantly, I think it's the right thing to do given the concerns that the community has raised.
Yeah, it's also important, again, as a risk assessor, I assess theoretical risks that I hope never come to pass. In Port Hope, we're comparing, well, what you're balancing as a council, what the CNSC will have to balance, is comparing a theoretical risk, the one that we're talking about tonight, with a very not theoretical impact that's happening in the community. I said impact, but it should be plural, impacts. Many impacts. Jen already talked about some of them, but those risks aren't theoretical. They're actually happening right now.
So the reduction to the private properties, the reduction of impact on private properties, this is a visualization only. Don't hold me to it. But on average, when we've looked at the numbers, we see approximately, on average, I'm going to say approximately on average, 30% increase in scope on private properties as a result of continuously going after arsenic in the soil. So not all properties will be 30%. Some will be less than 30%. Some might be more than 30%. But when you look at all of the data, and we do have lots of data, that's what we're seeing. So we can say with some certainty that this will result in less of an impact to individual properties, some more than others from an impact perspective. This is the slide that Robert was referring to, where it is difficult to see the differences between the different criterion. On the right would be the current cleanup criterion for arsenic at 18 and the level, sorry, that's left. Yeah, my husband says the same thing. So we have the values on the left in blue, which is the current arsenic criterion of 18. And I'd really like to draw your attention to, it's not me. Okay. I'd really like to draw your attention to the western portion, where you see a big difference in the two blobs between blue and orange. That's the Alexander Street Ravine. So even without the application of the special circumstance, if we had had this criterion change passed through the system already, the Alexander Street Ravine wouldn't have required remediation, with the exception of the area that we are currently remediating. Okay, the area we are currently remediating, remember I talked about those two different types of arsenic deposition. We have the stack deposition and we have the fill. The fill always has other contaminants in it, radiological contaminants. And that's what we see in the Alexander Street Ravine where we're doing our remediation right now. That was an end dump area for fill. That absolutely needed to be remediated, no question about it. The rest of the ravine, which has low-level stack deposition of arsenic, would probably have passed with the change to the criterion. Instead, we applied a special circumstance because the criterion had not gone through its regulatory process yet. If you look at the orange, you'll see, especially where the woodlots are, there's going to be a huge reduction in required scope in those woodlots. Now, the thing you have to remember, and this is key, and I'm going to say it several times, we have 21 contaminants of potential concern, metals, that we clean up to in our license. This only shows arsenic. So our decisions are not just arsenic based. Our decisions are based on the full suite of metals that we have to clean up. In the absence of having any of the other metals present, because they're less mobile in soil, where we've just got arsenic left because it's more mobile in soil, that's where this change is really going to be effective. Okay, and I do want to stress that there are 20 other metals we have to clean up for. Reduction in the impact on trees. Robert's way better than mine. Silly little animation. I'll go with the video with the music any day. But it will have an impact in terms of reducing the number of trees. Again, I'm not going to comment on the number of trees. That's just going to get me into trouble. When we talk about reducing the number of trees, we're looking at the woodlots. We're looking at how you define a tree. Is a tree, a single woody stem at 5 centimeters diameter above breast height? Like, there's ways of defining trees. Or could a tree be an area? Could it be a gathering of vegetation? Could it be bushes and trees commingled? Because on our natural woodlots, we have understory, right? So when we talk about reducing impact on trees, I'd like us to instead focus on reducing impact to our naturalized environments. What is all of this going to result in? It's going to result in us getting in and out of properties faster, which is going to reduce our impact on members of the community. It's going to reduce the amount of time we're on people's properties, and we're disrupting their lives. It's going to reduce the stress that we're causing within the community as we come in and out of people's properties. We're going to be able to issue compliance letters much more quickly. And those compliance letters will give mortgage lenders, banks, the confidence they need to provide mortgages without question to residents of Port Hope. However, we still have the Property Value Protection Program and other programs available if residents do have questions that come up by the financial institutions. It'll reduce stigma and fear within the community and potentially from others moving into the community when they learn about the program. And from a land use perspective, no restrictions on land use. Current land use is residential, and you cannot go to a more restrictive land use than residential, so no restriction on current or future land use. So in summary, I'd like to discuss that the incremental lifetime cancer risk for a resident of Port Hope is similar to that of anyone else within the Canadian population. There's no significant difference between 18 parts per million or micrograms per gram in soil and 50 parts per million in soil. However, this will result in a dramatic improvement to the way we're able to implement the program. It will reduce the amount of time on people's properties, will reduce traffic disruptions, noise, and dust, less damage to vegetation and ecosystems. Fewer properties will require cleanup, less soil removal on the bulk of the properties requiring remediation. You'll get your compliance letters faster, and there will be no future restrictions on property use. These are the tangible benefits from the change versus, as Ron said, the theoretical risks with that very conservative risk assessment approach. Thank you very much for your time tonight.
Thank you very much. Again, no applause. Thank you. We will go around and ask for some comments and questions to the presenters. I started on this side this last time. I'm going to start in the middle. I'm going to start with asking a couple of questions, and then we'll move around the table. Really appreciate, Ron, you taking us so carefully through the steps in the risk assessment that you undertook. And a few things came to mind, which is one, given the range of arsenic levels that have been deemed to be safe and acceptable in other communities, including in Canada and internationally, why 50? Why not higher?
I think maybe you should answer that because I think it's a science policy question rather than a science question.
For those who have been following the change to the cleanup criterion process in 2019 and early in 2020, our first proposed value for arsenic was 100 parts per million in soil. We had lots of discussions with the federal and provincial regulators about that value. Health Canada, as the primary guidance department at the federal level, indicated that they could not be supportive of 100 parts per million based on the way they would prefer the risk assessment be undertaken, which is based on risk, conservative risk values. And we needed to move this forward. So the other issue at play at the time was there are two different risk assessment models that we can use. There's the federal risk assessment model and there's the provincial risk assessment model. Federally, the risk is 1 in 100,000 and provincially is 1 in a million. So the inputs to the model and the model themselves at a policy level are already very different. And we were trying to get the federal policymakers and the provincial policymakers to meet in the middle. And that requires deviation from a standard policy, which technical people can't really do at the government level.
Yeah.
Let
me jump in here.
So Ron's going to jump in here because I'm going to get myself maybe into trouble. But over the course of 4 years of dispositioning comments that came in from both Health Canada and the Ministry of the Environment, in an effort to minimize the difference in risk for residents of Port Hope, the number changed from 100 to 56 to 50. And 50 is where we're at right now.
Yeah, I should say that the risk assessment that the consulting team produced is in its 4th iteration now. And each round of comments and responses can take up to a year in some cases, 6 months to a year at least. So, you know, right when you asked your question and I immediately handed it off to Jen, I said it was a science policy issue. I want to explain myself. There's science, and then there's the science we're allowed to use. So, as a risk assessor myself, I might want to use all the latest and greatest information I can find. But when I put it into the government guidance cookie cutter approach, that tells me that I must do certain things. In other words, one of the things it might tell me is that I have to use the maximum concentration ever measured in soil. I can't use an average or something else. So that's science policy rather than science. If I had my druthers, every decision I made would be as realistic as possible. And I'd leave it to decision makers like council or the province or the feds to decide what to do about my findings, right? That's the difference between risk assessment and risk management. But by prescribing certain decisions in the guidance, they take away the risk assessor's ability to do whatever they think is right scientifically. And the 100 just didn't fly from a policy point of view. So the consulting team proposed a lower number that could be supported.
Thank you for that explanation. I think that's really important for everyone to be aware of, the distinction between what we're talking about. And I guess maybe this is more of a science question, so I'm not sure if it's fitting in further complicating this, but you did a risk assessment looking at levels in terms of what that would mean to excess cancer related to arsenic. But I'm wondering, in any one study, can you actually hold for one factor and say that that is actually linked to excess cancer? And on the flip side, we're looking at a risk factor of arsenic. What about mitigating factors that come from maintaining tree canopies and the health benefits that they produce for a community? Does that not factor into science policy?
It should. It should. And in fact, you as a council are much more qualified than I am, except that I'm a citizen where I live. You know, I'm qualified to have an opinion as a citizen. But how much is a tree canopy worth versus an excess cancer? I don't know the answer. I don't know how to weigh those things. And I don't know of a risk assessment that would know how to incorporate that. We know how to assess risks related to exposures to chemicals. I can assess some of the biological mitigating factors, but I couldn't weigh the impact of a cancer risk versus the offsetting benefit of a tree. I don't know how to do that, except as a citizen.
Thank you for that. Did you want
Sorry,
to?
was there another question?
The first part of your question was, can we really tell the difference in
What was the
cancer
second?
risk between arsenic only and other
Oh, I
positive
see.
factors?
Yes, we can. We can. Arsenic is extremely well studied around the world, and most of our information about arsenic and cancer comes from a very heavily exposed population in Taiwan. And where that was really the only substance that was contributing to the types of outcomes they were looking at. That is great, but it also complicates interpretation of that information because those people had a much higher level of exposure. Their exposure was coming through water, whereas in Canada, most of our exposure comes through food. And furthermore, they had a very high exposure level. We have a low exposure level here. So again, this is another example of taking all the information, finding out what the worst case could be, and assuming that that's true. It's another example of how these risk assessments tend to err on the side of overestimating risk.
Thank you for all that patient explanation. Councillor Less.
So I understand the frustration of my community, and we're the first line of, if you're going to get some complaints, it usually will come to us first. So I look at the feds now and I say, well, I don't think they know what they're doing, the policymakers, because it's not based on science. Because if it was based on science, it would be a more precise number. No, and not an accommodated number. You know, who's to say 100 is the right number? Who's to say 50 is the right number? Okay? But so to protect their butts, they come in with this accommodated number. So I have very little faith in what they're doing. And I can't understand why it takes 4 years and probably another 2 years to come to say, go ahead. Let's bite the bullet and do it. And that's where my frustration comes in, and I'm sure everybody else's. Thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor Todd.
Thank you for the presentation. I actually only had the one question and you asked it. I was very curious as to why we couldn't go higher. And I guess with that is, as we do special circumstances, if we can sort of commingle those two ideas.
The higher you try to propose the number, the more you're deviating from the script, the prescription. There's a prescribed way of doing a risk assessment. And if you deviate to higher and higher numbers, you're moving further away from the comfort zone of the guidance that the feds have put out. When you engage, I mean, I've trained the feds. I used to work for Environment Canada. That was my very first job. So I definitely don't want to be bashing. They're very good scientists, but they have to set policy not just for Port Hope, but for the Northwest Territories mine remediation, for Halifax natural arsenic in groundwater. So they take a pan-Canadian approach, and they come up with guidance that will work okay everywhere. But you have to deviate from it a little bit based on site-specific information. So why use, for example, why use the Canadian average concentration of arsenic in drinking water when I could just call the Port Hope utility, get their data, and use the real number that was measured here, right? That's okay by the feds. But as you make those little changes to their guidance, it starts to erode their confidence in what you've produced. And it makes for a tougher engagement. And I sometimes I get the feeling that the individual scientists we're talking to understand what we're saying, and maybe they even agree. But the comment we get back often is, it's not consistent with our guidance. That takes my mind to, this is a science policy issue. We're not going, and in other words, we're not going to satisfy the regulator by arguing science.
Deputy Mayor? Okay. Councillor Mink, any comments?
Thank you. So I have two questions. One is, we started off with 16 parts per million, and we've gone different, considered 50, 56, now we're at 50. Maybe you can't answer this question, but do we foresee 4 years from now, 6 years from now, back at the table talking about 100 parts per million? Do you see that could be a consideration?
I think council has an opportunity here to make a decision on what their preference is on behalf of the community. From a risk assessment perspective, we use the models, we put in the numbers, and we look at the difference in risk. And then we have the discussion with the province as the primary regulator, having jurisdiction once this project is finished, if that's an acceptable increase in risk from their perspective. It might be acceptable, as you saw in their table, if we were to provide different values for different land uses, right? So a play yard of a school might have a lower value than
50, say.
of 50, for instance, and a higher value where the receptors we know aren't so sensitive. So there are still discussions to be had at the provincial level. We're presenting the risk assessment data as it stands right now at revision 4. It doesn't mean we can't go to a revision 5.
It also doesn't mean that, as Jen said, you can't start with a 50 for residential land use, and then in some subsequent application or alternate process, suggest that higher values might be suitable for auto body shops, or industrial land, or lumber yards where they keep pressure treated wood. Maybe you could justify a higher number for certain properties. You've also got the special circumstance lever that you can pull that I've heard about today.
Thank you. And that's sort of why I asked the question, is that there's community members right now who went through very stressful, some traumatizing experiences with the 16 parts per million. And I fear us making a decision today going 50 and having some community members have to bear that. And then 4 years from now, we change it yet again. I'm trying to be considerate of that.
There's still going to be huge impacts on the community at 18 or 50.
Right.
But 50 feels more like it's the right size.
It does feel like the right size, and whatever we decide moving forward over the next, I'd say, 2 months will be the number we stick with. We are not going to go back for another change at any point in the future.
Thank you. And my second question is regarding special circumstances. And if when we're talking about chasing arsenic, and I've heard the time it takes to test and send it off and test and go back. So if we leave a tree, for example, and clean up all around that tree, I don't know how I can ask this question. What is the risk of the contaminants under that tree continuing to travel? Like, where's the end to that?
So this change affects arsenic specifically. But if we choose to leave a tree on a property using the special circumstances protocol, then whatever contamination exists underneath the root ball of that tree will stay underneath the root ball of that tree, with the exception of arsenic. That metal is a little bit more mobile. So at the subsurface, you may get movement of the arsenic into the area that was previously remediated. However, the special circumstances protocol has 6 constraints. And Councillor, I think we need to do maybe another session just about special circumstances, because I could talk on this subject for quite a while. However, property owners have the ability to make the decision, and there's something called a compelling reason. So if a property owner makes a decision to leave a tree on their property, and at any point during that 20-year liability period, the tree dies and falls over, or the tree needs to be removed for a reason, and suddenly we have access to that soil that we know has contamination within it, has the metals within it, then we can go in to remove that soil. The stickler at that point is that the Government of Canada will not pay for restoration. We'll take possession of the soil, we'll dispose of the soil appropriately, whether it's at the long-term waste management facility or elsewhere. But the restoration of the property and those costs will rest with the property owner. So that's the only difference with that special circumstance protocol within that 20-year liability period.
And I wanted to just throw in 2 cents about exposure. So I'm always thinking about, how is the arsenic going to get to the person? So suppose it's an apple tree. We eat the fruit of the apple tree. Well, we already found out from Jen that vegetation isn't taking the arsenic up, so I'm not worried about that. Is a child going to be able to dig under the tree to get to the soil that's affected? No. Arsenic isn't volatile, so it's not going to evaporate into the air that people are breathing. So as long as there's a tree sitting on it, I'm not concerned about exposure. Now, the question about mobility of the arsenic is mobile. What makes it move? Groundwater, right? It's not going to rain under the tree. The tree is stopping water from getting where that specific arsenic is. So it would only be arsenic that flows, only groundwater that flows under the tree that could have even the potential of mobilizing the arsenic. And that water would be below the surface. So the arsenic that's mobilized stays below the surface where there's no potential for exposure.
Thank you. Councillor Adam.
Thank you. So a good majority of my question was already answered already. And it's kind of on the process and the time that the first submission and then where we are now 4 years later. And what I kind of see is that, correct me if I'm wrong, you guys want to change these minimum levels, bring them up. What I'm seeing is that I believe that the majority of council also seems to be, and I don't want to speak for them, they can do their own thing, want to bring these up. I have a feeling that a lot of people out in the audience right now want to bring these up. And then my question to you is, what's your ask of us? Like when is it appropriate for us to give you that direction to say, yes, we want this?
we're at a pivotal point in the process where we have responded to comments several times over the last 4 years. We're technically on revision 5 because there was a draft, and we start always at 0. So there have been many revisions. My nickname is Jen Arsenic. So now is the time to make your voices heard. The previous council was supportive of the decision made by the regulator, and they put that in writing. The municipality of Port Hope would be supportive of the decision of the regulator because the decision does rest with the regulator. Your opportunity here is to come forward with a stronger voice, to contact the regulatory agency, the Ministry of the Environment, Conservation and Parks directly, to contact the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission directly with your unwavering support, if that is how you feel, for the change to the cleanup criterion for arsenic.
Thank you. Councillor Darrell.
Okay, so a lot of information. You've done a very good job of selling me that arsenic is relatively safe.
Not at all.
Well,
Not at all.
so anyway, so my question is, you said you did 25,000 soil samples. Was that in Port Hope? And the range was between 3 and 23 parts per million. So with a level right now at 18, that seems marginal, right? So would that be the, I guess I'm trying to figure out how to word this right. So with,
Sorry, I just want to correct
Yeah.
one little thing. That 3 to 23 was for naturally occurring arsenic.
oh, okay. Well, that changes things. What is, so what would the average be of the arsenic we're going after as far as parts per million?
When we look at the stack deposition areas, the values of arsenic surficially range anywhere from the low 20s to the low 40s. The higher levels of arsenic are typically associated with the fill material.
Okay. So I guess my question is, being well under the 50 that you're going for, is there not a way, is there enough scientific evidence that in areas of Port Hope that are older neighborhoods that we're not going to see new development in, is there not a process that could just take arsenic out of the equation for the cleanup criteria in general? That's kind of what I wanted to get to.
Unfortunately not. So as I tried to convey, and maybe not clearly enough in the first couple of slides, the cleanup criteria is part of our license. The license and the compliance letters go hand in hand. We have to demonstrate compliance with the license requirements in order to complete the program. So because all 21 metals are in the license, we have to demonstrate compliance with the levels that we've committed to cleaning up for all 21 metals. So there's an option to remove arsenic completely from the license. I do not believe that would ever be successful at the regulatory level because arsenic does pose a risk at higher levels to human health and the environment. And we've already made a commitment to clean it up. And we know it is part of what we define as low-level radioactive waste. What we're trying to do is find a level that will allow us to preserve the natural environment while meeting our commitments to remove low-level radioactive waste from the community, because we've made that commitment in our legal agreement, in our environmental assessment, and in our waste nuclear substance license.
Thanks.
Thank you. If you'd like to make a comment, I wanted to give you the chair. Yes.
Before I take the chair. I just wanted to say, I wasn't sure I was going to speak tonight. I know I've spoken about this issue many times before, but I think it's just, I'm taking stock right now of the position that we find ourselves in as a community. This project only exists because we demanded it. The regulators in Ottawa, the scientists at the province and the federal government were not concerned about the soil in Port Hope until we demanded that they be concerned about the soil in Port Hope. And yet here we are now in a situation where we can't get out of this contract. and this license, right? This was a decision made by well-meaning people based on the best information available at the time. We are now a different group of people with different information at our disposal. And so I think when we're talking about the special circumstances, keeping in mind that that is an onerous process that we would be putting on individual residents to have to navigate. I think the approach of leaving it to the regulators is concerning, because my sense, as you talk about science policy, is they are going to be more beholden to those numbers in the table that is the policy than they are in the interests of the people of Port Hope. Whereas this body and the people in the room today and the people watching at home, we're here because we care about the interests of this community. So I think we need to take that very seriously. And I really hope that this council will take responsibility and make a decision and voice the interests of Port Hope, and hope very much that the regulators listen to us.
That are expressed here, and so we're keeping decorum. I'm going to pass the chair to the deputy mayor, and I think that and I'll put my hand up to speak.
Mayor Elena, if you'd like
Thank
to
you.
speak.
Yes. I think that the discussion we've had about science policy is a really important one. And I think it has to also be met with a discussion about all the different stakeholders and the politics that are involved in making any kind of change, especially when we're talking about regulations. And we know it's been a very long road for this community. I know it's been very frustrating. I know we've had a lot of back and forth with it. And here we find ourselves. And so at this point, I'm going to put forward a motion that this council accept the raising to the 50 parts per million, and we move on, because we've got a process to get through and we've waited a long enough time for it. And from my own personal perspective, and I hope that some of my councillors share this perspective, I don't see any value added of waiting any longer or having any further discussions. From a scientific perspective, it's compelling. From a science policy perspective, it's frustrating. From a political perspective, it's even more frustrating, but we have the power to make a decision today on the thing that we can control. So I'd like to put forward a motion, and I'm throwing this over. The clerk is
Okay, so we have
the clerk is looking at me with a little bit of trepidation and has just asked for 1 moment. She's trying.
yes, Councillor Mink.
Sorry, just in the meantime, to add some more pressure to the clerk. This is a very important decision, and I think a recorded vote I would like to ask.
I think the clerk is asking for a 5 minutes to do some work. So we're going to take a 5-minute recess and we'll resume in 5 minutes. Okay. Thank you, everybody. If you could take your seats, we're going to reconvene. Okay, so we have a motion on the table that's been moved by Mayor Elena, and I'm going to look to the clerk to provide the wording for that motion.
Thank you, Chair Holloway Wadwani. So subject to the mayor's approval, based on the comment that she just made, the motion that we believe that she wanted to put forward is that council support the cleanup criterion change for arsenic from 18 parts per million to 50 parts per million in the waste nuclear substance license issued to the Canadian Nuclear Laboratories, and that staff be directed to send a letter to the CNSC notifying them of the support.
Thank you. Does that meet with your approval, Mayor Elena?
It does.
Okay, so you've put me in the situation of not being able to second the motion, sadly, but we'd be looking for a seconder on that motion. Councillor Adam. So it's been moved by Mayor Elena, seconded by Councillor Adam. And Councillor Mink has asked that we have a recorded vote. But before we move to a vote, I'd ask if there's any further comment or discussion from any members of council. Seeing none, then I will turn it to the clerk to walk us through the recorded vote.
Thank you very much, Chair Holloway Wadwani. So a recorded vote has been requested by Councillor Mink in accordance with Procedure Bylaw Section 52. So what I will now be doing is I will be moving through the council members, asking them to vote either a yes or no to the motion that is on the floor. I am going to read the motion one more time. That council support the cleanup criterion change for arsenic from 18 parts per million to 50 parts per million in the waste nuclear substance license issued to the Canadian Nuclear Laboratories, and that staff be directed to send a letter to the CNSC notifying them of the support. This motion has been moved by Mayor Hankivsky and has been seconded by Councillor Pearson. So we will start first with Councillor Andrews.
Yes.
Councillor Attridge.
Yes.
Deputy Mayor, Chair Holloway Wadwani.
Yes.
Councillor Mink.
Yes.
Councillor Pearson.
Yes.
Councillor Toms.
Yes.
Mayor Hankivsky.
A big yes. Hey, no clapping, please, no clapping, no clapping.
Yes. So Mayor,
So
so what,
the motion is carried
the motion is carried.
unanimously. And I'll now hand the chair back to Mayor Elena.
Thank you. So we move on to item number 5, which is our confirmatory bylaw. And I want to just clarify for everybody that this decision is final. It's not going to any other council meeting for any further approval. This is a final decision of your council. Moving on to item number 5, confirmatory bylaw. It is now time for the confirmatory bylaw. This bylaw confirms the proceedings that took place this evening and provides for formal adoption through a bylaw. Can I get a mover and seconder for that? Moved by Councillor Adam, seconded by Councillor Mink. All in favor? This concludes our business to be covered on today's agenda. We have reached the end of our agenda and it is 7:30 p.m. Thank you very much for all of you being here tonight.